Hey everyone, welcome to this week's episode of Soundbites. We got a really interesting guest, Jamie Dixon. He's the author of a new book called The Story Habit: How Leaders Shape Stories That Drive Action. So we're really, really excited to have Jamie on today. Besides that, he's a coach. He trains in both English and Mandarin, fluent in Japanese. Had a really interesting experience over the last 16 years, and we're really excited to hear your story. Jamie, thanks for coming on, man. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me. And I'm only conversational in Japanese, not fluent in Japanese. But thank you very much anyway.
We'll go with fluent. That's close enough. Like if you can get anything more than food and water, I think for our sakes that's pretty good.
Very
So
impressive.
so let's hear your story, Jamie. You grew up in the UK, you moved to Asia. Let's talk through that. Like what started you up, and what brought you to Asia?
Mm. So it really all started after I graduated from university. And I had graduated from university and I was working in a coffee shop, which is not really what you want to be doing when you graduate from university. So and one day I had an argument with my girlfriend at the time, and I just thought, well, this isn't going very well. Maybe
This
I'll,
isn't what I had planned. Yeah.
yeah, this is not what I had planned. So maybe I'll just try leaving the country. And just in a fit of rage, I went home that night and I submitted my CV to TEFL.com, teaching English as a foreign language. And a few hours later, I calmed down. I thought maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe I don't have to leave the country. But the next morning, I woke up and I had job offers from all around the world, and Costa Rica, Mexico, South Korea, Japan, and China. And I was looking at all of these job offers and thinking, every single one of these looks so much better than going to this coffee shop this morning. And so I really got sucked in. And long story short, there was one opportunity in China in particular that really appealed to me, and they needed me there in 3 weeks' time. So I basically said yes, and broke up with my girlfriend, quit my job, packed up all of my things, moved back home, went to London, got the visa, got everything else sorted, and 3 weeks later I was in China. And it wasn't until a few weeks after I'd arrived in China that I suddenly went, "Holy crap, I'm in China!" And if I'd taken the time to think about it, I'm not sure I would have arrived in China. But I kind of started as an English teacher and learned Mandarin on the side, and decided after a year that I wanted to stay in China long term. And so my plan was to leverage my Mandarin skills, because I'd learned Mandarin very quickly. Actually, I
Hmm.
was conversational after about 3 months, although
Oh wow.
I was having like the same conversations every single day, so it wasn't super conversational. But it just kind of, once it got to a certain level, I could just continue using Mandarin to learn Mandarin, and so I then leveraged that to get into corporate, and then they kind of took me to where I am right now. Eventually.
Yeah, it's amazing that like every life decision that usually people kind of plan out that are really really difficult, big huge steps, you took like all four of those possible
At
life
the same
changes
time.
and did them all right at once, right? Which is that's really fascinating. It's scary, it's brave, but yeah, once you got there, it must have been really really exciting. Um, yeah, wow.
Well,
I'm
once
trying to.
things like slowed down, once you realized 2 weeks after you were in China, you're like, holy crap, I'm in China. What was the most surprising thing to you? What was like the biggest culture shock for you that you had to get used to?
Well, the thing that comes to mind right now is on the car journey from the airport to the city that I was going to be in. I was really, really thirsty, and Derek, you've probably had this experience because I know you spent time in China. But we stopped off at a restaurant, and they ordered a cup of water, and I was so looking forward to it. It was boiling hot, and
Oh.
which is not what you want when you're really thirsty. And they're obsessed with hot water. Apparently, it's the cure for everything. Although I'm completely brought into it because
Immersed.
I have my cup of hot water right next to me now. There's
Yeah, I
been
think
Yeah,
One
go
of my
ahead.
first experiences with that was having a really big night out in like LKF in Hong Kong, like Hong Kong Fong, and then like we're going out for brunch the next morning, and all you want is tall glass of ice water, and that's not what you're going to receive when you're not at the hotel. You're not at the Western Hotel. You
Mm.
go to a restaurant, it's hot water, and then you're using that to clean your utensils, and then you're using it as a beverage, which
Yes.
is different.
Multi-purpose.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
it's a different experience.
Yeah, very multi-purpose. Yeah.
So, how did you enjoy your English teaching? How did you find that part of your journey?
Mm. So for about 2 years, it was pretty fun actually. But you with English teaching, there's a bit of a stigma attached to it in expat circles in China. At least there was when I was an English teacher, and the stigma is that you're only an English teacher because you can't do anything else, which is not true for every English teacher, but at that time it definitely was true for me. And so it it really knocked my self confidence. And really did actually knock my self confidence. And I really felt quite self conscious when I was around other people who had proper jobs, and so I was really determined to get out of that. Having said that, it's still a pretty good job actually, and I know some people who, that's their career, and cool, fair enough. You can make a career of it if you want to, but for me, it wasn't really for me, and so I moved to Shanghai, and I really really wanted to just get out of English teaching and do whatever the hell I could. And my sister's boyfriend at the time was a headhunter and made lots of money. So I thought, well, maybe I'll do that. I want to make lots of money. So and I speak Mandarin, so maybe I can get a job as a headhunter. So I went around to all of these headhunting companies and said, I'd like to be a headhunter and blah, blah, blah. And they all, I got interviewed by quite a few, but none of them gave me a job offer. But one of them kept my CV on record, and a few months later, phoned me up and said, "We have this interesting job opportunity. It's with Amway China, and they have this training institute, and they need someone who is a Westerner, so a native English speaker who speaks Mandarin, who also has experience in the classroom." And I ticked all of those
All
boxes.
of those.
Yeah, and it really was a really really timely opportunity, because it's the kind of position that it was just made up to fit certain circumstances at that time. It's not a position that would normally be around,
Sure.
uh, and and so I put my heart and soul into the interview process. And I remember the year of the interview was actually the year of the ox, which is the year I was born in. And by Chinese culture, if you want good luck, then during your year you're supposed to wear red underwear. So each time I went to the job interviews, I wore red underwear, and I got the job, so it worked.
So it paid off.
Yeah, it paid off. And and
Uh,
yeah, go ahead.
no, that's just a fascinating story. How like literally everything lined up, like everything that had to come together for that to work. Like you had to have been in a situation where you were working in a coffee shop and didn't like it. You had to make that really bold decision to just move. You had to take an opportunity that you may not have initially thought you were going to love, which was to be an English teacher. And then all of those things all aligned to put you on the path that you're on right now, which we'll talk about some more of that stuff, but it's just fascinating how one decision or one situation you found yourself in was completely life altering.
Yeah, and with a lot of people in this industry, so I work in leadership development as a coach and trainer, and a lot of other people I've spoken to in this industry, their journey has been very similar. Like no one in, well, I'm not sure about no one intends to, but hardly anyone I've spoken to so far intended to end up in this position, and then it was one thing after another, and oh wow, this is this is really cool. I can do this, and so it's, yeah, just one opportunity after another opens up all sorts of random doors you could never have thought of before.
Yeah,
Wow.
That's pretty great. So let's talk about your leadership development. So you went through the English teaching program, which serendipitously created an opportunity for you to get the role at Amway. You moved through your Amway career. You taught Mandarin to yourself, and then you started doing real serious leadership development. Let's walk through that a little bit.
Mm. So another similar story, actually, where as I was working in Amway, I was my job was to help the Amway Southeast Asian affiliates leverage Amway China's training resources. So I was jumping around Southeast Asia quite a lot, which was really cool from my position teaching English to all of a sudden flying around Asia. And I that was my introduction to the world of leadership development. I was sitting in workshops on emotional intelligence, resilience, people management, sales skills, communication skills, and so on. And I just found it fascinating, and I think that was my calling. I should have really studied psychology at university.
Mm.
If I'd studied psychology, I wouldn't have been working in a coffee shop. I'm pretty sure. Um, and so I found it really, really fascinating. And I was really struck by the jobs that these people were doing, these facilitators and coaches and trainers. And their work and their life just looked so fascinating and appealing to me. And I wondered if I could do that. And I remember as I started having these thoughts, I was every so often I go out to networking events just to meet new people, and I bumped into this guy called Mario, who he was a trainer, and he was doing the kind of training I wanted to do. And I said, I work in this position right now. I speak Mandarin. I know a bit about the culture. I would love to do that job. Do you think I can do that job? And he said, absolutely. And I thought, okay, wow, well, that's given me a lot of confidence. And so I went back to the office the next day, and we had this thing called the Big Black Book. It's a training directory of all the training services providers in China, and so I emailed every single one of them. There was like 100 or so companies, and I said, I want to be a trainer. I want to be a trainer. I want to be a trainer. Can I be a trainer? Please, 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 please. And about five of them replied back to me. But one was a small training company that had been set up by an Australian and a British man. They had been hit very badly by the financial crisis. They had downsized significantly, but it was now 2011 and they were starting to grow again. And as I sent them that email, they were actually starting to recruit new foreign trainers. And they said, actually, we have this train the trainer workshop. And it was basically like The Apprentice. They asked me to go to the workshop. They teach me how to be a trainer, but they'd also be monitoring me. And so again, I put my heart and soul into it. I put so much heart and soul into it. I actually made myself sick. I had the flu after I did it, and I passed. They gave me the job, and it was life changing, that job, because that was like a real step into the industry that I don't think I would have got otherwise. So that really paid off.
You talk a lot about, opening the Big Black Book and emailing a bunch of people and, like studying for something until you made yourself sick. Is that something that you had done in the past, or was this just, something new based on this newfound sort of interest and passion of yours?
Before I came to China, I was never like that. I was, because the part of the UK that I grew up in was very, very middle class and not very ambitious, and people don't really have big dreams and work very hard. And actually, hard work was kind of frowned upon in that kind of culture. And then I came to China and I discovered that if I work really, really hard at something, like when I was an English teacher and I was looking for jobs as a headhunter, I would also spend probably 4 hours every day for about a month emailing my CV out to every job opportunity I could. And I was doing it then. When I was learning Mandarin, it was the same thing. I was spending hours in my room learning, and then I'd go out and I'd speak to people on the street, and I learned really quickly. And so it was my experience in China that taught me that I can work really, really hard. Like I have this in me. Um, in recent years, I've discovered that it can be a weakness as well, because sometimes you
Mm.
work too hard and not strategically enough. So you have to
Mm.
balance it a bit. But I definitely didn't have that before I came to China. It's either something that China gave me or that I just discovered in China. I'm not sure.
Mm.
I think, that first domino of making the trip over there and then learning you had to fend for yourself and then you were in charge of changing your own circumstance kind of put you on that path to
Yeah,
nobody's going to do it for me.
yeah,
So if I want to change this, I have to do it on my own. Which it's fascinating. It's tough enough being in a different country with different culture and then a different language. Even where certain places people speak English, it doesn't. It's not everywhere, right? So it's like you have to make that decision that I have to do this if I want to be able to survive or grow or thrive. And then getting into corporate training, that's a really interesting story. It's like yeah, well, you can come here and we'll teach you some things, but this is a tryout,
mm,
right? So
mm.
you have to really go full throttle at it. No, it's really great. So you went to this training event, which ended up being an interview and a tryout all on its own. And then what? Like then how did you make that next jump?
So basically, long story short, there they recruited me. They decided they liked me, and so they brought me in to their company, gave me a job, and that was my entry into the world of corporate training. And I started with very simple things. It was email writing and presentation skills
Mm.
workshops, and email writing was maybe a step above English teaching, but paid a lot better than English teaching.
Sure.
And presentation skills was something that it's still a really cool topic that I enjoy training now, because you see a change instantly in people. And it's not too difficult to master, even to train it. Uh, so those were the two ones that I started off with, and over time I would start doing more and more of my training in Mandarin, and I worked out that the way the industry works, the way the industry works, if you're working for a training company, the people that matter most are the salespeople. If you build
Hmm.
trust with the salespeople, they will just sell you for everything.
Mm.
And so I latched onto that pretty quickly, and I leveraged my Mandarin skills and my cultural understanding, because I was married to my wife at that point, who's Chinese, and my 2 years, it wasn't many years, but my 2 years working in Amway China was a deep cultural exposure as well, because I was the only foreigner in the whole of Amway China out of like
Wow.
7,000 employees. So I had a
That's just
pretty good,
crazy.
yeah, yeah, it was kind of crazy. So I had a pretty good understanding of the culture, and I leveraged that to get really good relationships with the salespeople. And then gradually, I became the top selling trainer in the company. And I kind of just sussed out that game. And 3 years later, I decided it was time to go off on my own. Um, and I actually still like, now it's been almost 10 years since I went off on my own, and I still do quite a lot of work with that company, but do more and more work with other companies. And so after I left that company, I started networking with more and more trainers. And I remember the in the weeks after I left, I reached out to as many other trainers as I could, and I said, "Can I buy you lunch?" And you
Mm.
introduce me to people, and and that's what they did. Like I got so many introductions to different training companies, international training companies, local training companies, other trainers who then introduced me to other people, and that really taught me the power of networking, because it's all about networking. And
Hmm.
now, like 10 years later, he's still here in China, and I actually won't be in China for much longer. But right now in China, my life is pretty easy because of that
Mm.
networking that I did. I get work come in on my phone every week. I don't really have to hustle for it. It just comes in because of what I did back then. So yeah, a lot of hustling back then.
And
What advice would you give to someone maybe who's shy to network or maybe intimidated by it? It sounds like you kind of put yourself out there and talk to those trainers and say, I'll buy you lunch if you introduce me to people. So how would you advise someone to jump into that if it's not comfortable for them innately?
Well, I'm actually quite introverted, and I find I find going to networking events and socializing and networking and so on. I find it quite draining actually, and so
Yeah.
that when I was a child, I was actually quite shy because I think as an introvert, you probably start off shy, but doesn't mean you have to stay shy. I learned to
Mm.
socialize, and I learned a really like a few really easy tricks. And one easy trick is that people love to talk about themselves. I mean, I'm doing it right now, and I'm thoroughly enjoying myself. And people are generally the same. You give them an opportunity to talk about what they think, what they've done, what their stories are, what their experiences are, and they'll just happily talk on and on and on and on. And so, if you want to get really good at networking, and you don't like socializing much, just learn to ask questions. And that's a lot easier for an introvert to do because you don't have to talk so much, and people love it when you ask them questions like you're interested in them, and they want to, yeah, they want to spend more time with you because of that. So that works really well for me.
and even if they don't say too much, like, or I mean, sorry, even if you don't say too much in that conversation, they walk away like, "Oh, that was a really nice person." It's like
Yeah.
they said 6 words the whole time, but they extracted their
Yes.
story from them. They got to talk about themselves, so they feel really nice and good.
Yeah.
Um, we've learned that quite a bit too. So like Lauren's background's in journalism, so
Mm.
extracting stories and questions from
Ah,
people is kind of in her DNA, which is fun. And then part of the podcast is we've always been in positions where we've had to give answers, right? Like be on the hot spot, give solutions, solve problems, and it's like, man, it's really nice to extract stories from people where we get to hear them talk versus us just ramble on, as hard as that is for us sometimes. But it's interesting. I think you mentioned in your corporate training, it's like the communications and the relationships are the number one and number two things. And then if you can start nailing those and then parlay that into applying it to new people, to create a network, like you almost become unstoppable, right? Like you create a machine or a mechanism that now brings you opportunities versus you needing to continuously hunt and kill to get them.
yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
So you had a really interesting career, interesting pathway into opening or creating your own corporate leadership training company and doing it in a foreign country. Is most of your work based in China, or is it all over Asia, Southeast Asia?
Most has been China based,
Hmm.
and mostly with Chinese employees and Chinese leaders as well. Some in and around the Asia Pacific region, and increasingly in other regions now as well, thanks to the online world. But it's mostly been in China. Yeah.
What are the biggest challenges you face when working with leaders in Chinese companies?
Well, one thing, when I started as a freelancer, so after I left that training company, I started on my own. I was working with a lot of international training companies, and I quickly discovered that the way they design training in Europe and the US, it doesn't really go down very well in China. And the reason is because our Western style of thinking is we love concepts and high level ideas and abstract thinking, and we love having debates in the abstract arena, and philosophical discussions and political discussions, and not really talking about things that actually impact our day-to-day lives. There's
Mm.
a lot of those kinds of discussions. And um, and a lot of training materials, I noticed that uh, they were taking a lot of models, academic theories, concepts, and so on, and they would introduce them, and then there were, you then give the participants time to discuss, how would I apply this? And in China, it just did not work. Because
Mm,
in the Chinese people, they would always be saying, 怎么落地? How do you get it to come down to earth?
Mm.
How do I get the 干货, the thing that I can actually physically take away? And uh, and the reason for that is Chinese people are, well, whereas we are conceptual in our thinking, they are contextual in their thinking. And I learned something quite interesting last year, that, um, for example, the word the, the function of the word the in Western languages, and I think a lot of European languages have their equivalent words, the function is to isolate something from context. So you wouldn't say it's this pen or a pen, you'd say it's the pen.
mm,
And those words don't exist in Chinese or Japanese, at least, and I assume a lot of other Asian cultures, because they're so contextual in their thinking. And so everything has to be connected to something else. And so an interesting dynamic I notice when I'm in a training room and there are Westerners and there are Chinese is the Westerners will happily be discussing the ideas and the Chinese are discussing examples. And
Mm.
how do I use this? What's the, what's the action
The
step?
application.
Yeah, the
Mhm.
application, and that's all they. It's pretty much all they care about.
mm.
So that was a real challenge for me, and actually inspired me to write my first book, which was all, and that was really me trying to figure out how can I design a training approach that appeals to them. And it took me 6 years to write that book, but the outcome was is so simple. It's just any content that I train people on, I condense into tools like checklists, templates,
Mm.
processes, and whatever. And I don't treat the tool as gospel, but I I give them the tool. I explain how the tool works. I explain the theory behind it. I show some examples, and then I let them go away and practice. And then that gets them to applying much, much faster. And it's only when they apply that they actually start to learn things. So that actually helps me spend less time on the content side of things. Um,
Mm.
so that was a really, really interesting cultural difference that I noticed.
And I think things like that, when you think of culture, cultural differences, and growing in a culture, you don't think about things like that. You think about day to day behavioral differences, day to day
Mm,
pattern differences, foods, like how people socialize. Like these are what you think of when you think of cultural differences. The way somebody learns and applies is rarely in the top of your head as a massive cultural difference that can make and break the effectiveness of what you're doing,
yeah.
right? And it's tough. Like we both run global teams, and we've had to experience that quite a bit. It's like when you're not getting the results as a leader that you're expecting to get, sometimes you need to step back and think, okay, what's the missing puzzle piece here? What is different about my teammates that I am no longer effective in coaching them? How can I get through that and change things? And it's like you being able to recognize that and building a process in place to take what had continually been done from Western companies, but you being embedded in the culture allowed you to see the most effective way to make your clients really thrive by applying the material.
Yeah, and an interesting example that I notice a lot of Western managers encounter when they come to China, and you probably faced this yourself if you've worked with Chinese people and probably figured it out as well. You're in a meeting and you ask them a question, and then silence, and
Mhm.
you're asking for their opinion, and silence, and the solution is to kind of tell them what kind of answer I want, or give them a structure within which they can fill in their answers. I want a list of 7 ideas, or tell me all of the bad things about what I just
Mm,
said. I want to hear 5 bad things in total. So give me a list. Like when you get that specific, all of a sudden they start providing a lot more. But a lot of Western managers who come to China they really, really struggle with that, and it takes them a long time to figure that out. And it's another one of those things that you were just describing, that it's not the everyday behavioral habits that we notice. It's the thinking that's deep rooted, and they like a lot more structure. Yeah.
Mm.
Do you think the Western training method of just talking more about concepts, not context, is a problem? I'm thinking about all of the trainings I've done, and I think we talk about a lot of high level topics, but the application does become a challenge. And I think that's why we continue to go to these trainings, maybe because it doesn't stick, because we don't talk about how to apply them. Is that sort of what are your thoughts on that?
I have a lot of thoughts on that, because there's a lot of debate in the learning and development world about the effectiveness of training, and I think one of the reasons, and actually training has a really bad reputation in the corporate world for its effectiveness, and I think one of the reasons is because content is thrown at people and it's not contextualized. So
Mm-hmm.
I definitely think that can be a problem. At the same time, the Chinese liking of the step by step approach and the takeaway that I can use also reflects their, I'll just say it quite bluntly, their low quality education, because
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't teach them to think for themselves.
Mm.
And so I think that kind of approach to training is, it's arisen in Western countries because um, people don't push back against it. People are used to thinking for themselves, and you give them a concept and say, "How would you apply this?" And people are used to going through that kind of process to think for themselves, and it's kind of what they expect as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and that's what we've always kind of done in Western education too. So I've noticed a lot of Western facilitators I've worked with who have no experience in Asia. They're not even, it's like they're not even aware of it, because it's
Mm-hmm.
just something that's so normal to us in the West. So I do think it's a problem, but it's not a problem that is so obvious, actually.
Mm.
Yeah.
And because it's so subtle, you end up missing it, and half the time you don't even realize you've missed it. To your point about you use an example of a manager might say, "Ah, you guys have any feedback, anything about that? All right, let's go get them." And then you get that person probably reinforces in their own head, "Man, my team's quiet,"
Yeah.
when really they're not. You're not getting the right question to get the right answer from, which I think probably leads us into our next topic. So your latest book, you had mentioned your last book. We got your latest one here.
Thank you.
Let's talk through that. What inspired you to write The Story Habit? What inspired you to create this book? And what is the path that brought you to it?
Mm. So, because my first book was about practical training, and there was a period about 6 years ago where clients all of a sudden started asking me for training on storytelling skills. And it was like it had become a buzzword, and quite suddenly as well. And so they'd ask me, "Can I do storytelling?" And I'm like, I don't know. I don't really have a storytelling course. Why are you interested in storytelling?" And I was really quite curious at the time, because I was naturally a good storyteller, because you acquire that skill when you spend a lot of time in the classroom. But I was not conscious of how I was doing that, and so I couldn't really
Mm.
train it. Um, and so, as I ask clients, "Why do you want storytelling skills training?" they'd say, "Well, we have this group of engineers, and every time they do their monthly reports, they send people to sleep. So we want them to do storytelling." So then I'd go away and I'd research storytelling, and I'd read books and go on Google and YouTube and whatever. And I'd constantly come across this model called the hero's journey, which
Yeah.
I'm sure you've heard of, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners have probably heard of. And the idea of the hero's journey is someone starts off as a normal person in their normal world, and then something horrible happens, and they go on an adventure, and it changes them, and then they come back as a hero. And that's a fantastic structure if you are writing the next Game of Thrones. But if you're trying to improve your monthly report, it's just overkill. And I was looking at these storytelling courses on the market, and why are you overcomplicating your monthly
Yeah,
reports? This is not what
yeah.
people need. So I was
It's the
really
main character train versus the actual being able to deliver information cleanly, right?
right, and that's exactly the point that I stumbled upon. It's that um, when they were asking for storytelling training, what they were really asking for was, can you help our staff make meaning better? Uh, because they're not good at taking this information and presenting it in a meaningful way, and
Yeah.
that is ultimately what we mean by story. And storytelling has a lot of implications. Typically, when we hear of it, we think of telling stories or novels or movies or whatever. Um, but a much bigger application is the stories that people believe in. And as a real practical example, right now, just yesterday, the Chinese Communist Party had their big 20th meeting, and lots of plans have been laid out for the future, and I'm stuck in between the Westerners that I'm speaking to who are going, oh my god, what on earth is happening? This is terrible. uh, China's going to cut itself off from the rest of the world. And then my Chinese family, my wife is Chinese, and her family and the Chinese people I'm speaking to are going, yay, this is cool, we've got our own unique way of being for the next decade or so. And it's all stories. And
Mm-hmm.
so that is what I think is the bigger picture with storytelling. It's not just about telling stories, it's about trying to shape those stories that people believe in. And as I was researching the story habit, I eventually realized that telling stories and shaping the stories people believe in, they actually work in exactly the same way. uh, a story is almost like a metaphor for how the mind works. So it was
Mm-hmm.
really fascinating researching it.
And it's the very point you made right now kind of comes back full circle. The cultural differences really determine, or the audience really determines, how the same story might be received. It can be a Rorschach test. So shaping that story for the audience who's trying to receive it, so they get the takeaway that you want them to have, is really important, and it's a skill that not a lot of people possess, especially in probably international business circles.
I definitely say so. I think it's a skill a lot of people lack. And one of the, I have this framework in the book called Relate, Challenge, Resolve. And it's a framework for telling stories. You have a character that the audience can relate to, who meets a challenge, and then there's a resolution. But when you're trying to influence people and shape the stories that they believe in, um, what a lot of people do first is they go straight to challenge and they say, you're wrong, I'm right, here's all the reasons I'm right, here's all the reasons you're wrong. What you really need to do is start by relating first. And I noticed most people don't have that naturally, actually, including
Sure.
myself. So yeah, it's definitely something that I think a lot of people would benefit from learning more of.
Absolutely. Oh, Lauren, looks like your audio dropped out and you got muted.
Oh my gosh, sorry about that. So
That's a first.
I know this is the first time. Okay, so I'm curious, like who should read this book? Is it somebody who's an engineer who's trying to make their monthly reports better? Is it somebody who's maybe trying to communicate with their partner in a relationship? Is it a CEO of a startup? Like who's the best person to read this book and who would get the most value, or is it all three?
So I've written the book specifically with leaders in mind. So anyone who is working in a company, leading people, managing teams of people, trying to get people to buy into their vision, buy into their business, their brand, whatever. That's who I've written it for. But as I've started distributing copies, I've had people in education say
Mm.
this is this is great, and even people who say this has helped them think about things for their family as well. It because storytelling is a universal skill, really. It's something that you can use with anyone in any culture, in any language, even without language, actually. So it applies to anyone, but I've specifically written it for leaders in mind. Yeah.
And even like the graphs inside of it are very driven towards someone who has that type of experience, which is really nice to see. So you have a concept, and then you try to give good visuals, good pathways, good checklists through it, which is really fantastic. Like, yeah, I'm really excited to dig into the rest of it. We've only got through it a little bit, but we're gonna rip through the rest of it, and I'm pretty pumped about it so far. And yeah, it's fascinating to see the path that you've taken so far. From I keep bringing back up the original point, but you started in a coffee shop. You being unhappy made you take a path that just started every step changed the trajectory of your life just a little bit. And we glossed over this. You mentioned it, but we haven't really hit on it. You being unsatisfied with a coffee shop led you to a situation where you met your wife and you had two children, right? Which is pretty wild. It's just when you think of all of that thing, um,
Yeah.
how
I
much that changed.
I once uh, I once went to see a coach about some anxiety I was having around something. Whenever I fly, I get terrible anxiety, and he did timeline therapy, which is where you go back through your memories throughout your life, and you go back in time. And um, I won't go into details of what we looked at, but one thing I realized is if I'd kind of actually had a plan a lot earlier, if I'd had a plan when I was at university and I've been more proactive about getting a career at that point, I don't think my life would have turned out as interesting as it is right now. And so I was really glad when I had that insight. And I think for any young people listening who are in a situation like I was in that coffee shop, you know, your life is exactly well. There's a lot more opportunities that you're going to stumble upon than you can think of. So yeah, it can turn out quite well.
That's probably a good segue into the next question. But Lauren, you want to grab this one probably?
Yeah, I love this question. It's my favorite. So, if you could go back in time and talk to your 25-year-old self, because I think that's a more interesting one based on where I think you'd be at that point. What advice would you give to the 25-year-old version of you, knowing what you know now?
You know, I just tell myself to continue doing what I was doing at that point because
Mm.
it's worked out for me. I my life is still not where I would like it to be exactly, but a lot of the things I did back then, I am benefiting from now.
Mm.
So I'd probably go back and thank myself and say, keep it up. It's going to
I
work
love
out
the
for you.
answer. I love the
Yeah.
answer. I don't think we've ever gotten that one. We typically don't get too many repeats, so that's
No,
a great one.
we've been doing it for a while. We haven't had. I don't think we've had any repeats. We had a series of a theme for a while that was appreciate things in the moment was kind of a theme of like two or three of them. But other than that, we haven't had the same answer twice, which is why we like this question so much. And then what the future looks like. So you mentioned moving out of Asia. So you're moving back to the UK. What brought you to that decision, and kind of what's your timeline? What are you thinking about doing when you get back there?
Yeah. So there's a lot of things that led me to wanting to move back to the UK. Zero COVID here in China is one of those things because that's been quite scary, to be honest. Um, but also, my oldest son, he'll be old enough to start school next year. But also, if I'm entirely honest, I've realized I'm in my comfort zone here in China. And as I mentioned earlier, I don't really need to do anything now, and work just falls in my lap. And it kind of doesn't really challenge me enough anymore.
Hmm.
So I need to throw myself off a cliff and move myself and my family back to a country that's going through a cost of living crisis and an upcoming recession. And try try picking my business up over there and see what happens.
Well,
Well,
I mean,
well,
you've been through crazier stuff, right? I mean, if you
I
moved your
guess
coffee
so.
shop to Asia on a whim, I think you can go back and handle some economic downturns.
Yeah, I guess so. I guess so.
but luckily, like based on what you do, the having a little bit of strife and volatility and turbulence creates opportunities for people
Mm,
like you that are able to do that. And I think when COVID first hit here, we were kind of concerned. Like we had this brand new fledgling startup, and we're like, this is going to be scary. Like this is a terrible time
mm,
to start a business. And it turned out to be great. It's kind of
mm.
like one of those things. If you looked back at it, if in 2019 we knew the world was going to end in 2020, we'd be like, yeah, maybe we wait to see what happens, and we wouldn't have done this, and it
Yeah,
would have been wouldn't have worked out as well. Like, so it's kind
yeah.
of interesting to have those lenses and perspectives. Well, I want to touch on this really quickly, just for my own curiosity. What is it like? What has it been like living in China from 2019 to today with the zero COVID policies in place? Like, that has to
Mm.
be very unique.
Yeah, yeah. So, for the first year, it was actually really good, and I was really proud to be here because I was looking at the disaster that COVID was in the West. In the U.S. seemed
Like
to.
Italy got really hit hard. That was bad.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of Western countries just didn't manage it at all in the first year. US doesn't seem to do a good job of it. The UK didn't seem to do a good job of it. And so I was really proud during the first year to be in China. But then 2022, it took a kind of scary turn, to be
Mm.
honest. As other countries, got their act together and adapted, and okay, now we're going to live with COVID. China just doubled down on zero
Mm.
COVID, and the lockdown was quite scary because at one point we were afraid our kids would be taken away from us, like 4 years old and 2 years old. Because if they tested positive, there was actually a period during the lockdown where children, regardless of how old they were, would be taken to quarantine on their own. Uh, and there were some videos going around of toddlers in a hospital ward all on their own, and parents going out of their minds. And so every day we were going for COVID tests, and um, uh, so you'd be on lockdown, so you'd be in your apartment all the time. The only time you could possibly be exposed to COVID was when you were going out for the COVID tests in your compound. And
The irony.
yeah, and that is actually how a lot of people, in fact, pretty much everyone I know who got COVID during lockdown, that is how they got it through the COVID tests. Is the How else would you get it? Because you're at home all the time. And so I had the worst anxiety that I like, physically painful anxiety. And we were rationing food at one point as well. And to be very, be very frank, my mother passed away in 2021. And it's been a year and a half since she passed away, and I still haven't been back to see her grave. So that,
Uh,
yeah, that kind of,
It's hard.
yeah, yeah, that
Yeah.
it's hard. Yeah. So I'd say it started off really, really well, but it's a disaster now, is what I.
Adapted to the changing realities of COVID. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's,
Yeah. They've
I
just.
can't imagine. I can't imagine having kids and being
Yeah.
worried about them taking away. That would cause severe anxiety for any parent. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I have to assume that's who the book's dedicated to.
Yeah. Yeah.
aw.
To my mom. Yeah.
Well, that's a really interesting perspective. It's we don't have a lot of opportunity to talk to people that are really experiencing it, that are Westerners that are trapped over there, right? Well, I guess "trapped's" the wrong word. That are there right now during the experience.
Well, for
Yeah,
me, it
really
feels like
interesting.
I'm trapped.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was trying to be
Then after
kind with
being
the
at home
words.
that long, it starts to feel like you're trapped a little bit.
Yeah.
So,
Well, Jamie, we don't want to hold you up too much longer, but last question: what, besides your own content, what books and media are you really interested in right now? What are you listening to on podcasts? What audio books? What actual physical books are on your desk?
So I don't have any physical books. I'm a digital man, but the books that have had a big influence on my thinking over the last year, and especially during lockdown, are the Chinese classics, the Tao Te Ching and the I
Mm,
Ching, the Book of Changes. And there's actually a an author called Jeremy Lent who really got me interested in Taoism. He has two fantastic books. One called The Patterning Instinct, which is all about it's one of those cognitive history books, quite similar to *Sapiens* by Yuval Noah Harari,
Mm-hmm.
oh yeah.
Mm-hmm.
but in my opinion, better than *Sapiens* because he steps out and takes an even broader view of things. And his second book, *The Web of Meaning*, is all about a culture that we should develop if we want to have a sustainable and ecological civilization. And so he got me very, very interested in Taoism. And um, so the Tao Te Ching is a very interesting book to read. But the I Ching, the Book of Changes, is it's a little bit like reading a horoscope, but I don't really believe in horoscopes or any of that stuff, and Taoism doesn't really encourage that. Taoism encourages you just to take whatever you get and make the most of it. And
Hmm.
with the I Ching, you you know you approach the book with some kind of question in mind, and you flip to a random page, and you see what answer you get, and it's full of so much wisdom that whatever question you have, and whatever page you turn to, there's going to be some insight that is relevant. So I found that book a real comfort when I was on lockdown here in
I
Shanghai.
was gonna say,
Yeah,
I'm sure that was especially helpful during
yeah,
Yeah,
lockdown.
that's an
Taking
absolute.
whatever you get and making the most of it.
yeah.
It's only been the last few years for you.
Taoism and Stoicism are probably your only survival tools at that point.
Yes, I was also reading a lot of Stoicism as well. Both of those philosophies have a lot in common. So
Sure,
yeah.
really nice. And then Jamie, where can we find you? Like, where is everyone going to look for you that we can link up to?
So you can either check out my website shapingpaths.com, or thestoryhabit.com. Both will take you to the same website. You can also find me on LinkedIn, which is where I'm most active. Just look for Jamie Dixon. You'll find my face on an orange background. So
Awesome.
those are the best places.
We'll link to those too
Yeah.
in the video
Thank
after.
you.
So
Thank you.
Well, Jamie, this has been a lot of fun, man. Like a really interesting story. Just fascinating to hear the path. I'm really excited to see what you guys do or what you do going forward. Really excited to have a chance to run through the book, The Story Habit. And thank you so much for taking the time and walking us through your journey.
Thank you as well. Thank you very much.